All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Anna Yang. I'm the Executive Director of Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator, and we have an exciting panel this morning. This is probably the biggest panel that I've ever chaired, but because it's a big topic and it's very wide-ranging, so we thought that we should bring as diverse as perspective into this conversation. So this is a partnership that we have with Climate Arc during the London Climate Action Week, and we're aiming to explore this critical issue, which is fast-moving. This is probably also one of the sessions that I feel really out of my depth very quickly. But anyway, so please bear with me if you are deep expert on AI, or if that, some of the things that we may be not able to touch into that. So the idea today is just really just to have a very, very broad discussion around it on the intersection of AI, big data, large, like LLM, and climate investment decisions. So a couple of issues that I want to. So one is, we know last year we organized an event also with Climate Arc on data and disclosure. Right, we brought a group of people. Some of you may have been there, and in terms of sort of this space and why having open data accessible to everyone is really important, so that you can mainstream investment decision. The problem is we have this plethora of different kinds of frameworks, disclosures, and taxonomies. And some of them talk to each other, some of them don't. So how do we sort of manage that? And so with also the advancement of AI and LLM, will it disrupt or not? I was asked to do a very quick survey in the room. How many of you consider yourself to be AI geeks? Raise your hand. Okay, thank you. How many of you are climate geeks? Okay, cool. So we have, I'm using the word geeks as a, not as a negative connotation, but as a positive connotation, which is like, I am also a climate geek when I want to be. So we just wanted to understand the room a little bit. But with that, so we have today, a panel of amazing speakers. I'll go from this side. So we'll have Felix Preston, Director of Research and Program at Climate Arc, Michal Nachmani, Founder and CEO of Climate Policy Radar, Ian Claycher, Professor of Pension and Finance, Pro-Dean for International and Head of Center for Financial Technology and Innovation at University of Leeds. Carl, Research Director from KASM, Demos. You probably need to say the acronym later in terms of what does it mean. Matt Gray, co-founder and CEO of Transition Zero, and we have Bernice Lee, Research Director for Futures, Hoffman Distinguished Fellow for Sustainability, and also Chair of the Accelerator. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Felix.
Thanks very much, Anna. Thanks, everyone, for coming this morning. It's great to see you all. And like Anna said, I also feel like there's so much going on in this space that it's hard to exactly kind of plant a flag in the sand and take a particular perspective. But hopefully, together, we can start to sort of shed light on this conversation, even if we can't cover everything. I'm Felix Preston. I'm head of research at an organization called Climate Arc, which is about 1 year old. And we are working to mainstream climate into financial decision making. We're particularly focused on the data and the methodologies and pathways that financial institutions need to embed climate into their financial decision making. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how large language models in particular are being integrated into our workflow, but most of what I talk about is about how we think this technology is playing out in the wider ecosystem and how we might want to respond to that. In a kind of quick mapping exercise of what we think is going on in this space, our team's identified about 40 AI-powered tools in the climate finance space. This is probably just the tip of the iceberg, but it gives us a bit of a sense of what people are focusing on. It's a lot to do with kind of preparing information for disclosure, for identifying opportunities for emissions reduction, a lot to do with satellite data and asset level data, and also risk management. That's broadly speaking like where we're seeing a lot of activity. We're going to hear from some specific cases on the panel today, so I won't dive into too much to that. And then there's also, of course, tools being developed within the financial system for financial decision making. Perhaps most sort of obviously Bloomberg released Bloomberg GPT. And there's been a number of other tools announced. To date, at least, in terms of how these tools are being described publicly, they're not focused on climate, but there's no reason why they might not bridge into that space. But kind of interesting that at the moment we've got those two slightly different worlds operating in parallel. We certainly don't know all of the different ways in which these tools are going to affect both our ability to analyse climate or how it's going to affect financial decision making. It's sort of too early to say, but that's really the value of this conversation. I just wanted to pull out 3 ways in which the kind of disruptions in the ecosystem are coming and how we're thinking about it. So firstly, as Anna mentioned, we're focused on the data. We had the discussion a year ago in this room on it. Robust analysis of how companies are doing on climate is critical. It's critical so that we can hold those companies to account, obviously, as a society or for policymakers, but also so that the same information is crucial for financial decision makers to plug into their models, into their decisions in different ways. And at the moment, we only really have high-quality analysis of a few hundred companies, crudely speaking. If you want to look across a range of key metrics, we're talking about 300, maybe 400 companies, not enough to cover the market. In order to scale that up, the current model is probably not possible to do it just in the same way. It's going to be too expensive. We don't have the capacity to do it. So obviously the excitement here is whether LLMs and associated technologies might be able to accelerate that much faster than we could otherwise. And just to unpack that a little, this work often looks like a human analyst finding all the information they can on a company from the company's disclosure on its website, what it discloses to CDP and through other vehicles, and trying to compare that with a science-based benchmark, which normally involves all sorts of methodological steps and checks. And this process can take days, sometimes weeks, conceivably even longer than that. So if you're trying to do this for many, many companies, there are obviously tens of thousands of large companies in the world, that's a really big challenge. And we think LLMs, therefore, could play a key role by kind of augmenting that human expertise in tasks like we're going to hear, I'm sure, a lot today on gathering data, synthesizing data, and many other kinds of applications. One of the earliest applications in our own workflow was something sort of rudimentary, but also quite time-consuming, potentially, connecting up different industrial classifications used by different entities just to find a common system. Obviously, you could do that just with a human analyst. It would have taken ages. Instead, we got kind of 90% of the way there in an hour or two, then with some human checking. It's not just quantity. I've mainly majored on quantity here, but obviously we need better analysis of companies. That's a moving frontier. We need to go deeper into the value chain. We need more place and space-based contextual information to really drill down on what matters for an individual company and its transition journey. So the hope is also that as that sophistication improves, this technology can be a partner in that. So that's the first one, a lot more analysis of corporates, and that is crucial for financial decision making. The second point is that a lot of this work is undertaken by non-profits. There are clearly a lot of really important commercial data activities going on as well, but a lot of the substrate of this arena is the work done by non-profits. And we had a look across the same universe of NGOs which we mapped out last year when we were looking at open data in particular, of about 50 organizations operating in this space. And we think about probably more than 3/4 of them are involved in activities which are surface level, obviously going to be disrupted a little bit, or you might say enabled by some of these technologies on things like scraping information from the web, extracting information from company reports, synthesizing information together. Also, coding is quite a big application for LLMs. And so we need to think a little bit about what that kind of synchronized shock in the ecosystem looks like. There's obviously an opportunity if we get it right, but it's also potentially a little bit paralyzing. We need to basically work together on that journey. And we think if we do so, it's a real opportunity to accelerate the cohesiveness and efficiency of the ecosystem of climate finance and data. And then the third point is perhaps the most obvious one. How are we going to ensure integrity and quality of data in the climate data value chain, if you like? It's technology, LLMs in particular, amplifies concerns that have always been there, but perhaps have accelerated with machine learning and other kinds of artificial intelligence in recent years on bias in the underlying data sets, the potential for misleading information, even disinformation, I think we're going to hear a little bit about on this panel. And clearly, what these models are able to do depends heavily on what information they can be trained on, and also, if you're going out to analyze a company, on what information is available to some extent on that company. So that's still going to mean a huge emphasis on the quality of disclosure. Big conversation in the climate finance space. If anything, it becomes more important, not less important, because of this. I suppose the additional challenge here is that we know that LLMs tend to invent or hallucinate answers even when they don't exist. So that's probably, that specific challenge is not one that we really had to figure out when we're actually, if you're an individual company and a misleading piece of information gets ascribed to you, it's obviously a big problem. So we have to figure out how we're going to handle that. We're not going to put the technology back in the box. So it's about figuring out what the right solutions are. I suppose just a final point on that is, at the moment, financial decision making connected with climate, it's not as if we're operating in a perfect data set. A lot of ESG and climate-related financial products are operating on data sets which are known to have lots of challenges. So this is just kind of a new dimension onto that, but it's not really a reason to not leverage these technologies, I think. So.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you. Michael, please.
Thank you. I'm Michael, and I have to start by talking about artificial intelligence as if it's a problem of bias and hallucination, just because it's fun to start like that. And we think about that because when we look at the state of the climate, we think that humans have no bias and no hallucination. Otherwise, everything would be okay, right? So hopefully artificial intelligence, which is trying to make things better, faster, deeper, have its problems. But I think that's just interesting to remind ourselves what is our starting point when we try solving these problems. For a long time, I was on the side of the disruptee, hopefully disruptee. So on the long, let's open documents and find our way through them, PDFs usually, with an attempt to find meaningful information. About 2.5 years ago, I founded Climate Policy Radar, which aims to be a disruptor, although we are not-for-profit, so not-for-profits can be disruptors as well. Climate Policy Radar aims to identify, to analyze, to organize, to democratize access to data on climate law and policy. I'm using the term law and policy very loosely as a set of rules that governs relationships between entities. So a state can set rules to its citizens and corporates. A contract can be a set of rules between two corporates or between customers and corporates. And so on, international agreements can be a set of rules between countries. And the reason why we look at laws and policies is because, first of all, we need better laws and policies in order to tackle climate change. And whether you are a country or whether you are a corporate that is subject to those laws and policies, or whether you're an investor who holds shares in a company that is governed by laws and policies, those laws and policies are relevant, and we need better ones. So we need to make better laws, and we need to hold lawmakers to account. Of course, we also need to track and aggregate and ask, where are we not legislating enough? So for example, the energy sector is highly regulated. The agriculture sector, on the other hand, with its climate impact, is very much under-regulated. So even being able to map and see from a bird's eye view, where is it that action is happening is important. And fourthly, and this is where, of course, the financial decisions come in, is when we model risk in order to make financial decisions as investors, bankers, insurers, policy data is not taken into account at all, or taken very anecdotally into account in those decisions. So physical risk is on the rise, right? We're more likely to know now if the hurricane is coming, and therefore, if we are about to invest in a hotel chain that is on a Caribbean island and the hurricane is coming, then that's a risk, and the investment might be at risk for that. Is there an early warning system is a policy question that might have an impact on the risk. What is the capacity of governments to recover from extreme weather events and so on? So understanding the policy landscape is critical in order to make robust financial decisions, and of course to invest in the transition, whether we are investing in new and frontier technologies, and whether we are moving away either very harshly and cutting out and divesting, and I'll talk about that in 1 second, is divesting based on data into that. So all of that is the why. And the how is just like Felix said. We need to read a lot of documents very quickly and to make sense of a lot of them and have a shared language and have a shared understanding of how to do that. And right now we are stuck because we don't have capacity and we don't understand, and therefore decisions which are being made anyway are being made in the absence of data. And what is clear about the absence of data is that it leads to bad decisions. Good data doesn't lead to good decisions, but it definitely puts us on the way there, right? But right now we're operating, and the largest players in the world and the largest investor coalitions in the world are operating with very, very limited data. Now, all of those questions that we need to ask ourselves translate usually into 2 big questions. What are my options? Usually translated into who's done it already and in what flavors did that come? And does it work? Does it work is, of course, a modeling questions. When companies report their Scope 3 emissions, what does that do? What does that do in the real world? Does that make them better citizens? Maybe they're reporting Scope 3 emissions, but continuing to have a lot of Scope 3 emissions. If corporates are part of trade associations that lobby against the Paris Agreement, I'm citing, by the way, metrics from the Transition Pathway Initiative and Climate Action 100+, both very large investor coalitions that are active investors asking their companies for reporting on certain metrics. Do these work? We can only have the answers to these if we check and track and aggregate and measure and in a very robust way. And LLMs can help us do just that. If we're asking those 2 big questions, who's done it already and does it work, we're going down to the Lego blocks. What are the Lego blocks that we're asking? We can then build, of course, any complex structure of those Lego blocks, but we need to think about industries, about technologies, about financial instruments, about governance mechanisms, right? And when we package all of those Lego blocks, we can ask very sophisticated questions. What are tax subsidies in Southeast Asia for green hydrogen? What are the governance mechanisms that companies in the rubber sector in Indonesia employ in order to move on, right? But all of those blocks can be identified today very, very quickly by LLMs because we're looking for words and we're looking for classifications and we're looking for structures. And LLMs today can answer sophisticated questions, and I don't mean typing into ChatGPT and getting a summary. I mean actually identifying those elements or those structures in the bottom. You can say, what is the quantified target of corporate X or of government X? And so on, 2 minutes, great. And when we do that, the ability to then say, here's 1,000 documents or here's 10,000 documents that I scraped from the web from your corporate reports, your CEO's tweets, your financial disclosures and so on, not even having to go to all of the mandated or voluntary disclosures and frameworks. The ability to do that very quickly increases. With that, the transparency, and we'll add to transparency if we do it with open models. So we know what it means when we asked for, do you belong in the transport sector? We're actually able to go and find out what it means to be in the transport sector, so somebody can say, oh, you missed that. Can you please change your models to integrate that? We're also moving towards reducing bias when we have open models. Transparency increases, everybody speaks the same language, and we're moving in the right direction. There are a lot of problems. I think we'll have opportunities to talk about those problems. But again, going back to the beginning, we need to remind ourselves where we are in terms of baseline now. I think I'll pause here now.
Thank you. Ian.
So I'm going to be the one that's not like the other in this panel because I'm going to take it out of climate completely in a minute. So one of the things which you'll frequently read and you'll hear in the press is we're going to get rid of mundane tasks. And that sounds fantastic. So all the boring work is going to go. But the problem with boring work is it's actually very important, because one of the things it does is it gives us experiential learning. And so actually, if you are a junior lawyer, if you are an auditor, if you are a PhD student, all the mundane things that you get to do are important. So the reason when you're a junior auditor, you go in and you do this repeated task, you get paid reasonably well for it, but it's the same thing over and over and over again, is one day you find something that's not like the other, and you then go to the person who's the partner and says, I found this, what do I do about that? And that person turns around and goes, you do this. And the reason they can tell you you do this is because they used to do what you were doing. And so that repeated process of doing really mundane tasks is hugely important. And one of the challenges that we have around things like ChatGPT and large language models is it abstracts that out. So if you're a climate analyst and you're going through lots and lots and lots of reports, you're going to learn something from that process. And so there's a real challenge between how do you develop genuine expertise and getting enough work done, because this isn't a problem that can make everybody an expert. So there's like a huge trade-off here between what computers and AI, that's AI very loosely defined for the two AI people in the room that are not on the panel, what it can actually do is really good in terms of scale and pace, but we've got to be really careful about what it can't do, and it can't make us all experts. The other thing as well, which is quite interesting, is, I said PhD students. So you can get a PhD student who could say, write me a literature review on pensions in the UK, and a large language model will produce that. It might even cite some of my own very tedious work. But the point is, the student doesn't know anything. So the student can't verify, it can't tell me, it can't critique that output. And so again, the process of going through that literature review and that very mundane task is to have a depth of expertise and understanding. The other thing which is interesting is once you put a machine of some sort in the process, we start to rely on the machine. Now, whether or not, we don't want to get into semantics, so we'll just say we're relying on some sort of AI. And when we look outside of this kind of area, there's some interesting sort of areas where AI or computer-aided something is much more advanced in financial services. And there was some really interesting work that looked at cancer detection, that looked at mammography. And what happened was, in computer-aided detection, the system shows areas of concern. So the radiographer's job is to then go and investigate and interrogate those areas of concern. But actually what all this research showed was, while you got improvements on average, it made people better at cancer detection because it highlighted a lot of stuff. The impact of that was differential, because for people who were more experienced, were better radiographers, they just ignored the machine. So what it meant was actually a lot of times where that was the process that was being used, harder to detect things were missed. And one of the problems that happened in this particular case is there was a huge number of false alarms. So the system, now this is about a decade old, so systems have improved and stuff. But what happened is you've got all these false alarms, and so I think everybody in the room will have sat through a fire alarm. You'll have been at your office, the fire alarm goes off, and you're going, there's no way I'm getting my bag. Actually, you're not meant to get your bag. But anyway, there's no way I'm getting up away from my desk, walking downstairs and leaving the building to find out that this is a false alarm. And so because the way in which the system worked had so many false positives, people started to ignore it. And so you get really bad outcomes. So the issue then becomes, for me, is it's not just about the scalability and the potential stripping out of expertise, it's also the fact that there's a human interaction with this. And if we take that into the field of analysts, if analysts don't have the expertise, they just believe the output. And then if you are a recipient of that, if you are, let's say, a pension fund trustee and you're getting some information, how do you understand the veracity of that, the fidelity of it? How do you know it's actually good? And that, if you've got to incorporate that into your decision making, that's really hard to do, because actually trustees, and I spotted somebody I know from the world of pensions already, trustees are already struggling to do things where we've got a much better handle on what good looks like. So I think there's a genuine concern around some of this from me when it goes from being experimental and it then starts to mainstream, and we've not necessarily answered all the questions around how good is the system, because people who are not expert will believe the system. And the system, if it's not built properly, could lead to bad outcomes. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ian. Actually, we have Matt, then Carl. Matt, over to you.
Great, thank you. I should have some slides coming up. There you go. Excellent. So what I'm going to do with my time is just give a practical example of how LLMs are used and what we've done to date to incorporate them into our workflow. So Transition Zero is a climate analytics not-for-profit. In the context of this conversation, we build complex electricity systems models. What that means in practice is the future of the electricity system or the electricity grid is going to be predominantly supplied by wind and solar, because that's the cheapest technology. And that in and of itself is a systems problem, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So that's what we do as an organisation, and to do that effectively we need as much high quality data as possible. So there's two boxes here. The current system, which is the top box, is how power plant data is collected at the moment, and this data then feeds into our system models to produce outputs about the future of the electricity system, how much it'll cost, consumers, supply and demand, all of those things. And what happens at the moment is there is a bunch of data on the internet. There's an analyst or a human reading that data, cutting and pasting it, and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet. That process works pretty well at the moment. I'd say the problems are it's slow and expensive, but it is very much accurate, providing there is a quality assurance process that is followed. What we did is, as part of our work at Transition Zero, because we're a technology company, we build software. 20% of our time is spent on doing R&D, so experiments about how we can do stuff more effectively in the future, automate things, and produce outputs that are more readily usable. So what we did is we developed a system using ChatGPT, which would do what the human would do. So instead of a human cut and pasting articles, the LLM did it. And what we found for the experiment that we did on Chinese power plants, so we looked at about 50 plants, is that we could update it more or less whenever we wanted. It was effectively free, so for those 50 or so plants that we did for China, it cost us about 50 cents. So a couple of $100 you can scale and do stuff very cheaply with these models. But what we also found is it wasn't investment grade. So we found that, and this is similar to Felix's point, is that you get sort of 80% of the way there, but there'll be a few mistakes. And for that reason, portfolio managers, people who are deploying and allocating capital, are not going to rely on these processes the way they are. Or they could, but they may find that they'll get themselves into quite significant trouble. So this is the future that we see, and this is something that we're productionizing at the moment with our partners, is you'll still have the LLM, but there'll be a person in the background who will be verifying or validating what the LLM is doing. That person, I think, will need to be quite highly qualified to be able to identify errors they'll need local expertise. So I think to Ian's point about LLMs not having expertise and not having the background, it's just effectively a probability-based model. We think that effective QA will be able to identify that, because what happens with our models, we'll build a systems model for Indonesia, for example. We'll take that and we'll engage the Indonesian government, Indonesian investors and campaigners, and they'll be able to tell straight away whether our data is accurate or not. So we don't see much of a challenge there. I think the challenge is more if you're using much bigger data sets where that subjectivity or the user relying on the data just doesn't have that background information or expertise. But what we think we can get to with this new system is a weekly update instead of quarterly updates, which is more useful for us. There'll be less humans, but I think that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a waste of time to get economists, engineers, physicists cutting and pasting stuff off the internet. They should be working on hard problems rather than doing that. I think potentially it's an issue with regards to data extraction more generally. So a lot of this work currently gets outsourced to places in the global south, so like Bangladesh, India will be doing a lot of the scraping. Those jobs will go, I think. And again, I think finally, if there is this process, there stands the greatest chance of it being both cheap, efficient, and investment grade, which is where you want to get to with these systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Carl, I realized that I didn't actually say which organization you're from, so please also do that in your...
Indeed. All right. Well, everyone, hi. Good morning still, I think. So I think time for something a little bit different, and I'll maybe introduce myself at the end if it's relevant, but maybe even more different to anyone else. I want to talk about the kind of swirling social and political forces that always kind of shape and accelerate and sometimes prevent and sometimes divert decisions around climate action. Sometimes big P political decisions, sometimes small p, sometimes to do with forces, social forces and norms. And there's probably one idea, I think, that has been more important than any other over our lifetimes in actually dictating what those forces are and how they work. It's an idea that probably began in the mid-noughties with militaries, believe it or not. Militaries, both liberal democratic and autocratic, they were all kind of asking themselves the same question. They were saying, we're now living in the information age, but we're these lumbering giants of metal and tanks and planes. How do we keep up? How do we keep up in the information age? And they all kind of, in this, I think, absolutely fateful and focal conceptual pivot, kind of each and every one of them kind of redefined what warfare was. And you can see this. If you go and pick up military doctrines, Russian, British, American first, you'll see this pivot happening in the noughties. They said, all right, well, information has always been a tool of war. It's always been something we've used to try and confuse the enemy. We've always tried to use it as a way of gaining tactical advantage. But they kind of began to talk about it in a different way. They began to talk about it as if it was joining air, sea, land, and space as a theatre of war, a space, really, that war happens within. And from that kind of pivot, kind of talking about information warfare, they began to build kind of the weapons and the maneuverings and the strategies and so on in order to be able to compete and win in information warfare. Now, that was an idea, obviously, that didn't actually hang around simply and exclusively in militaries for very long. We saw radical political extremist organizations. We saw political campaigns, disaffected individuals. All these other people, I think, began to pick up and begin to use the idea that information was a kind of conflicted, contested space that your enemies are in, that you need to be in, and that ultimately you need to kind of maneuver and dominate within in order to achieve the one thing, actually, that militaries, war warfare and information warfare all really care about ultimately, which is behavioral and attitudinal outcomes. That is what that is all about. Why am I telling you this brief story in my opening remarks? Well, firstly, what does it have to do with AI? A lot to do with AI. So as these kind of weapons and strategies were kind of beginning to be built up, as we began to kind of, and I work for both a think tank and I have a tech company that basically build the means to try and confront information warfare, we began to realize that both the tools on the offensive and defensive side were being driven more and more and more by machine learning. So as every election came around, as every large global issue started to be kind of impacted by information warfare, like we realized that both the kind of tools were being used to offensively try and dominate information spaces, and these might be online information spaces. Increasingly, actually, it was information warfare was being used on kind of financial and medical data as well. We kind of realized that it was almost like dueling maths. You know, like we would build models to try and detect kind of like bad actors. They would build models to try and camouflage what they were doing. And it was this kind of weird, hidden, reciprocal, recursive kind of arms race happening in ways actually that I don't think the kind of watching public almost ever saw. You know, sometimes the tech giants will talk a bit about it because they were trying to defend their information as well. Increasingly after 2016, governments will talk a bit more about it. But you have to know, everyone, whether it's about climate or anything else, that kind of arms race is currently happening, is always happening in this kind of subterranean and weird and quite hidden way underneath all the issues that we all care about. And of course, as GPT and large language models, the kind of last iteration of machine learning, artificial intelligence applications have become more widely used, we've seen them also joining this arms race as well. And that's both, I think, defensively, we use LLMs now to actually try and find bad actors. And you know, by the way, sidebar, people talk about this like it's disinformation. It really isn't really that much to do with disinformation. You can influence people in a tremendous array of different ways that have nothing to do with disinformation. You know, it's actually largely to do with the construction of identity and meaning and friendships and belonging, much more than it has to do with spamming you some lies. That's how you really get to influence people. I've actually interviewed people that have been on the offensive end of this, and they tell me the same thing every time. They say, Carl, we don't lie about the world to get people to change their view. We tell people things that they already believe about the world, make them even angrier, and then try and direct that anger in certain directions. Much, much more effective, much more reliable way of getting those behavioral outcomes. My big worry now with GPT, it actually isn't, I think, what most people are worrying about, which is the use of these generative models to kind of fake footage or fake images. I'm not too worried about that. I don't think most people trust that anyway. I think we actually are developing some technical responses to that. My worry is the use of GPT to create new friendships. So, like I'm kind of following. I wonder if people are in this room. There's kind of all these therapy bots that are being kind of used as applications of GPT, and people are saying, like, they tell me that they're like, I feel heard. This bot, like, you know, all this thing does is care about how your day is, what you worry about, what you're anxious about. It wants you more information. It's this brilliant listener, and kind of people are brought into these kind of actually quite meaningful long-term relationships with these things, where they feel heard by it in a way that they don't feel heard by human beings. In the hands of a bad actor, that is absolute gold dust. Because as we come up to the next COP summit, you know, as we talk about climate action in a broader sense, can you imagine the bad actors, the vested interests, if they begin to use those kinds of methodologies? You know, they bring 10,000 people into 10,000 in parallel friendship-based conversations to try and get them to gently introduce certain ideas into the way that they think. And then lastly, so that's the interaction with AI. Arms race, dueling models, weird new attack vectors, all of this moving forward very, very quickly. Big challenge for those of us on the front lines of this to try and like keep society up in a way with how this is all changing. But then lastly, I don't think there's a single field, and definitely not climate action, that can afford to ignore information warfare. Because as climate action in general, as COP summits, as activists, as journalists have all been brought to the front line, and as this has become increasingly used not just by militaries but by lobby groups, by shady corporate comms firms, by simply very, very rich individuals that might have certain views around climate action or how much or how little of it they actually want to happen, we are only going to see that get worse. And I think, like, for all, you know, anyone that works in this, whether it's climate financing, or whether it's political climate action, or it's about trying to pull together coalitions and keep them together, like we've got to build like more defensive layers to all the things that we do to try and confront the way that AI is going to be used to try and degrade that. So this is coming from a completely opposite direction, really. I'm interested in analytics and LLMs, but I'm also interested in how information spaces are being attacked by those self-same underlying approaches. And that's my kind of warning klaxon emoji to everyone. To think, as you go back, and there's lots of climate people here, if you go back from this event and you think about, oh, how is AI going to affect us? This isn't just an analytical opportunity. This is also a pretty big threat.
Thank you, Carl. I actually had a fleeting relationship with a ChatGPT therapist for 2 weeks, and I freaked out. I was like, oh my God, this is better than the conversation with my husband. Anyway, so.
I heard literally the same thing.
Yeah, so I was just like, okay, I need to shut this down. Bernice.
Well, I can't promise to be different like everybody else, but I can promise to be brief at this point so that we can get to the question as well. I did start my career, weirdly enough, on guns and bombs. And I did my first paper like 20 years ago on the Taiwan Strait crisis, where already information was part of the warfare. And it's certainly no different today than it was then. But what I thought, because I know I was going to be last, and because I don't work on either in detail, I work on both, but not in detail, I thought that what I could do is take us all the way up back to the loft. All the way back up to the high level thinking around what we kind of always knew, which is that machine intelligence, if we were to make the best use of it, what's going to be helping us figure out what is meaningful to us as human beings, right? Now, and I thought this is a great opportunity for us to think through some of these questions, partly because when it comes to climate finance and obviously in general dealing with climate-related threats, it is about one really important point that we often hear about, which is the word integrity. We've been thinking about this certainly here in this country since we hosted COP26, we being the government, obviously here, not me, but the whole idea that, we kind of know that the numbers don't really add up in some ways in terms of dealing with the challenge, and that means that we have to make sure that whatever is there is got integrity. Now, what does integrity comprise? Now, again, for lack of a better way of utterly cutting through a lot of noises, as we're talking about artificial intelligence, there'll be a lot of noises. Oftentimes, we're talking about three things, right? Intentionality, accuracy, and what's the third thing I had in mind? Transparency. Yeah, that's it. And now, the really interesting thing when it comes to what we're talking about ChatGPT, and in some ways, artificial intelligence, that none of the above are necessarily promised. We're not promising accuracy, transparency, nor for that matter, what's the third thing I said again? Yeah, accuracy, just kidding, sorry. Yeah. This is just to keep you interested. Now, then you ask yourself the question, accuracy, is it really that important to us? I mean, don't we do all sorts of things without actual accuracy? I mean, I've been talking to a good friend who's been doing satellite imagery about trees, right? We all know that we kind of want to hug a tree to make sure that the tree that we thought we're buying is there, but at the same time, do we really hug a tree? No, we don't, right? We trust proxies. We have proxies of trust. And the question then becomes, when it comes to not ourselves. I mean, by the way, I remember when I first went to university, which of course, I'm looking at the young faces around here, is 1,000,000 years ago by your standard. A friend of mine told me that his father was a stockbroker, and they would invest in a company at the time. If the guy is a guy, by the way, often at the time, comes for money, doesn't have a mustache, buckled shoes, or a bow tie. Now, that is literally the investment criteria, which would have meant that in those days, Richard Branson should never get any money ever, given that, in fact, I don't know whether he wears buckled shoes. Now, and I guess you see where I'm coming from, which is to sort of understand that a lot of decision making and also our aspiration for accuracy often is lost in the middle of criteria and factors that we put in place. And sometimes they're not necessarily better or worse than instinct, which is really what these stockbrokers are really talking about. And of course, at the moment, we have no manifestation of instincts from machine intelligence at this point. And I would be very interested to hear what Ian could tell us as well on this front, particularly on sort of lateral rather than linear logic in some ways, associative rather than associative logic rather than causal logic. Now, knowing that this is what it is, we also heard already from our panelists as well that what we do get is scale and in some ways efficiency, if not knowledge. So, or not, there's not, well, I don't know whether it's real knowledge or not, and we will find out more later on, not whether or not there are machines or humans, for that matter, who can help us figure out better how to make sure the knowledge is real or not. And which will leave me to really, I think, my last point today, which is that ultimately we kind of know that as we get to the next stage of decarbonization, perhaps we have already, I wouldn't say we're exhausted, we have used up a lot of low-hanging fruits. A lot of things that we know work, we know is important. And right now, the next phase is going to be about learning by doing, because ultimately, we never really had a blueprint. You know, we talk about it a lot right here. The question that we're in the middle of creative destruction, that we're building a new machinery while the old one is still running, while we're trying to destroy the old one at the same time. And because we have no blueprint, we have to do a lot of learning by doing. I think that making sure that it's not us rather than the machine now, we have to make sure it's learning by doing with us. So I just think that it presents very different and new kinds of challenge. And one of the panelists earlier talked about expectation, which is what I kind of want to end on. Felix, Preston over there and I have been colleagues for many years. This is obviously we're sort of home team kind of here in the past. We spent many years talking about, you know, autonomous driving. For many, many years, really. It's one of our favorite topics for many years. That, you know, we kind of know that ultimately, you know, if it's under 10, 12 miles, an hour, it's almost 100% safe. And in fact, in terms of London driving, the average driving speed is about 8 to 12 miles an hour. But of course, the problem is that you can't have machines and human working together. And at the same time, we have this criteria for machines that we need them to be 100% accurate, when in fact, we would never ask a driver to guarantee in their lifetime they would never make mistakes. And so in some sense, it's sort of making me think about how do we understand these questions about expectations, and also making the best out of the use, because I know that ultimately the question would be, can we make the best use of it? I think the answer is we have no choice but having to do so. But at the same time, a lot of what value we held dear are still important, but at the same time we may have to think about a different way to approach them so that we don't get stuck in our little straitjacket that we build for ourselves when our world is only us, not these. I mean, by the way, I'm going to check out these ChatGPT therapists. My therapists are really expensive. I'm hoping that it's cheaper. I'm thinking, you know what? I mean, there are times when I'm not sure whether or not my therapist is just giving me word association. So who knows? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Wow, so what we have now is actually about 40 minutes of Q&A. So could we turn on the light, please? So that we can see the people in the plenary as well. Yeah? Magic? Oh, yeah, there. And so what we're going to do actually is also, the Q&A session is going to be under Chatham House rule. So what it means is, because we're going to ask the participants for you to say your name and your organization, but so that for those who want to report back on what they heard, make sure that this is a non-attribution rule, okay? But what we want to is to enable people, enable this room to sort of explore, go into intellectual journey about what does it mean in terms of the large language models, LLMs and GPTs, and how does it how it enables us to make better investment decisions to accelerate the transition. So I'm going to open the floor. Questions. So name, organization, knowing that this is under non-attribution Chatham House rule. Okay, we have here and then two down there.
Hi, I'm Fabrizio from Senior Advisor at Climate Bonds Initiative. Thank you for the panel. It's been great. I have a question. So I think we know what we need to do to advance climate action. You know, there's pathways, there's a lot of information out there. I've just interviewed around 30 CFOs globally. I think we know what we need to do. I mean, of course, there are some challenges in terms of technologies and stuff. My question is very simple. How do you think that the technology, so AI, LLMs, etc., would really accelerate, let's say, that climate action that we need?
I'll take a couple of questions and then we'll come back to the. We have a lady here. Okay, there's a gentleman there and the lady here in orange.
Yeah, thank you very much. Simon Burkett, Clean Air in London. I'm a private and a corporate member. Thank you very much for the session. I'm an air pollution campaigner, Clean Air in London. The tip I would like to give you is that when you analyse climate data, and typically greenhouse gas data, is please think about the other bit of the air, because some of the solutions like diesel, wood burning or hydrogen may well break laws, and so you'll end up with gross errors. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Grace Smith, and I'm the Environmental Programming Director for a company called Laconic Global. We do environmental intelligence at scale. A question on data anonymity, because as an example, we're working with the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil, and talking to the government, they are very concerned on how to get farmers engaged in programs when they don't want to share data. And how do you look at data anonymity versus data scrutiny to inform policymakers towards decarbonisation roadmaps and NDCs? And on that, is there a consortium that you already run that aggregates the 40 or so experts in AI-powered tools? And if not, can we put one together?
Nice. Good one. So there is an acceleration question. I can't, sorry, my brain is not, I'm still like thinking about all the AI, but people are.
I'm happy with another question. Maybe other people can answer. So I want to build on that last question about the data anonymity, because I want to ask, maybe our panelists will understand. There's a movement at the moment around data sovereignty. I just want to hear you, because you guys are much more practitioner than I am on the data side. How much do you think the data sovereignty piece would be part of the solution? I.e. individual farmers, whoever they might be, hold on to them for life. Is it like a scarlet letter, but in a good way, I guess?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, well, maybe I was
Let's
gonna
go
start
from
on
here.
Decarbonisation.
Yeah, let's go
one.
from here
So-
in terms of who wants to pick up. Yeah.
Thanks and hi. Yeah, I nearly actually focused part of my talk on some of the decarbonisation opportunities, but chose not to in the end. I think there's like one category, a group of things like application of AI to data center efficiency or grid efficiency and so on, where there's some obvious efficiency gains that might be plugged into the existing system and help us to either configure the existing system in an optimal way or help to redesign it in a more efficient way. But I think, so maybe to come back to your initial point, we do know how to decarbonise each sector, but I think that plays out very differently when you're looking at an individual corporate's value chain and financial decisions that need to be made along it. So it's how we kind of connect those two worlds and measure that we're moving fast enough, in my view. So I mentioned sort of one set of tools in energy where I think there's already a lot of applications happening. I think the things where I'm most excited are value chain questions, where some of the challenges are associated with a lot of fragmentation coupled with the need for a huge amount of contextual information. And two panelists have already, and the question have already related to agricultural value chains. I think that's one, coupling the farmer's knowledge of their own environment with the collective knowledge of other things that might apply in their context. That's like potentially transformative. The other one is an area I've worked in my former life here on decarbonising construction value chain, steel and cement in particular, and other materials, where the need to deal with multiple variables at once tends to lead to a lot of conservatism, because it's just too complicated to ask an individual kind of builder to factor all of these different things in order to get to the right answer for sustainability. And maybe we're at the frontier of being able to do those sorts of things now.
Can I build on that one?
I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So how can it accelerate climate action? So a few answers. There's a company called Open Climate Fix. Open Climate Fix look and model how the clouds are hovering above solar panels. They do that in a 5-minute interval. So you could know if you're going to get sun or not going to get sun. Why does it matter? Because when you're sitting at the control room at a power plant and asking, do I plug the renewables in or do I rely on my coal generators, and how expensive it is to switch between the two, accurate modeling really matters. And if you know that the sun is going to shine and then not going to, your ability to do that and to provide predictability for the grid is higher. That encourages more renewable onboarding to the grid, for example, reduces the cost both for the providers and for the consumers, reduces air pollution, Simon, all of those things, right? So that is one thing where a lot of data and a lot of modeling and a lot of sophisticated machine learning modeling can be a very, very kind of straight-on accelerator to climate action. But it can also open the silos, because when we open the silos, it means that we're reading a lot of data together. And before, when I have a limited amount of time and a couple of research assistants whose job it is to analyze the data, it means I'm going to look here. I'm going to look here. I'm only going to look at languages that I speak already or that I have cheap translation access to. When I open up, because the machine is reading and auto-translating for me, I can read air pollution, right? I'm not limited now to CO2. I can also read the SO2. I'm not only limited to English, I can also read Swahili. By the way, I don't need to know Swahili in order to converse with somebody, and it's okay if I don't master the language, if I can use my auto-translate to establish a meaningful communication that will accelerate and actually get me what I want. So, of course, there's challenges, and we have to walk through that, but the urgency in which we're operating now means that we need to go big and fast at the risk of accuracy, like Bernice mentioned. And I think that when we think about all of those combined together, we need to remember that humans have a really strong bias for status quo. If we don't know better, we'll stay where we are. If investors don't have data, they will stick to their investment methods. If insurers don't have data, they will stick to their old models. What we now have to do is bomb the system with a lot of information that we already have the intuitions that is changing things, right? We already know that renewables is cheaper. We need that data to be out there. We already know that companies who are in supply chains where there's a law coming that will say that this is not going to happen anymore. If all the European countries are phasing out fossil fuel cars, then if you're building some piece that goes into the engine, in 5, 10, 15 years, you'll be out of work, right? Knowing that sooner, being able to integrate that knowledge into your planning, those are critical things that we need to know now so we can start changing those things. By the way, so we can ensure that all of those people have jobs afterwards and their communities don't fall apart because we've abandoned at a cliff edge and all of these things. So having all of that data in advance and being able to process it quickly so we can shift our status quo, that is what LLMs have the potential to do. And one final point for Carl. When you compare warfare, we need to remember that those big dynamics of warfare often tend to be power dynamics of equals, right? You have like big blocks who are fighting each other, disinformation, misinformation here, disinformation, misinformation here. With the climate, we're operating on decades of unequal power dynamics. We're looking at a very, very small set of actors who have put a lot of energy and data into misinformation and disinformation. We've known about climate change since 1965, right? That data was actively buried. We've known about climate modeling. Exxon has modeled it in the 70s. All of that is great. The knowledge is there. Opening it and creating data here and being able to democratize it and bring access so we can make decisions that are starting to be equal, that is something that we need to think about, and that's a bit different from the warfare dynamic. Equal principles, but our starting points are very different.
Bernice?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Felix said, and I think that the great opportunities around underutilized wedges are huge. And in a way, what we have done often with machine learning is to identify connections, but what we haven't done is to turn it around and say this should drive actual ecosystem building and action building. So for example, it could be about, as Felix rightly pointed out, and also what Michal said as well, if we based it around, let's say, a value chain, but also around circular economy, let's say, in a sector, in a country, and use it as a building point and see what you can build out from there. It's a very different starting point for climate action than the way we've been thinking about it. And that excites me a lot, because if we are going to make sure we're not losing opportunities around learning by doing, we have to make sure the doing works together with the thinking. And I think that, I'm sort of recalling a study that we did here like a decade ago where we looked at 60,000 patents. We literally have a human being looking at every single patent application. And by the way, we almost killed each other at the time, but it was a good piece of work. And we discovered, for example, that lots of oil majors at the time, we knew now, they have lots of carbon storage technology. We knew the solar technology related to cameras and, also satellite technology. Now that we know all of this, how do we actually use it positively to drive climate action? I think are the opportunities. So I'm positive about that possibility as a result. So.
Thank you. Ian?
So on the climate action piece, where I think it's got huge value is the bits that nobody really thinks about. So you can do all this kind of large-scale joining up things, but actually a lot of the focus is always on big companies and I think small private companies. There's a huge demand in the SME sector, and those are the companies that are poorest served by anything that's going on just now, because the focus is by and large big companies. So actually, in terms of climate action, I think where there's potentially huge value is to the SME sector, because we're going to be able to do things quicker and faster. But I wanted to also come back to Bernice's point. And when you look at these sort of GPT, large language models, one of the problems you've got is you get a loss of compression. So what happens is it's not a full picture. So every time information is there, there's little bits missing, and it uses a probabilistic way of determining what should go in there. And the way of thinking about it is it's like getting a photocopier and repeating and repeating and repeating. And every time you do it, the fidelity goes down. So that fidelity problem's a challenge. Now, it's a challenge today, it will be a challenge tomorrow. The thing that we then get to that I think is quite interesting is AI is really interesting because it does non-linearity, and it does it in a way which humans can't. So it's really powerful. It can detect patterns in data that a human can't. And where, for me, that becomes very obvious is something like computer vision. So what we do is we show a computer millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of images of a traffic light. And now a computer can pick out a traffic light in any picture. Now, that's because it's a it's an ergodic system. The challenge we have here is once we're in the world of the economy and companies and business, is it's non-ergodic, so it's responsive. And so where an AI is looking at data, it's not a fixed thing, it's in a dynamic system. And so companies respond to all these different incentives, so all the time, everything's moving, so it's a much harder challenge. And then for me, not to be really depressing, because actually for once I've not been the most depressing person on a panel, and that's a very rare occurrence. If you add that dynamic situation and then you overlay that with Carol's terrifying view of the world, where that information is not only in a dynamic system, but there's potentially poor quality information being pushed in, I think that's like a massive challenge.
I can't remember when I wasn't the most depressing person on a panel.
You should talk to Dylan at the back of the room.
By the way,
tell you about greenwashing.
By the way, like I'm not sure that the takeaway from my initial intervention was use ChatGPT as a therapy bot. just right. A quick thought about data. I think it's this is just depressing again. I promise I'll try and do something more optimistic in the next response. Like it is quite likely that we're going to see quite a powerful restriction of data in the next couple of years. Data's going to be more and more restricted, and it's coming from kind of two different directions, really. Like, firstly, all right, we can always use ChatGPT, but that actually the number of LLMs that have currently been constructed and are out there is a very small number. It's a very small number, and they are being seen as a massive tool of geopolitical advantage. You know, these are concentrations of power, and countries are asking where they sit, who owns them, where is the data, and how do we get ahead? And one of the ways that countries will get ahead is by increasingly trying to onshore data. That's one form of data sovereignty. So saying data has to sit within our shores, and we have to basically, ultimately, have control about where it goes. So we're going to see that happening, and there's almost nothing I think we can do about that particular trend. The other is individuals. I think the person in the audience, mentioned that I think that farmers just kind of don't want to kind of share their data, and that's so widespread, kind of global worry right now, right? Because it kind of feels like this is a revolution that's being done to us, not one that we're part of. I think that's a very, very widespread impression. It's true. It's permissionless innovation. We didn't ask for these LLMs to come out of the place, did we? I mean, they've just emerged. And suddenly we kind of feel like they've sucked in all our data and they can understand us and we don't understand them. It's a one-way street. And we're going to see increasing resistance, I think, and lack of trust around volunteering data, sensitive or not, to these models to understand us. There are some extremely exciting technical solutions coming out. It is, ladies and gentlemen, maybe the one use of blockchain. We found a use of blockchain at last. Yeah, like there's uses of blockchain called federated learning, essentially where you can train models without having to create some giant honeypot, global database of everyone's data. It's models that kind of learn at the level of the user and then bring back what they've learned to a central place. It's fiendishly technical. If anyone wants to jump in and render a technical explanation, I'd love them to do so. It is, on one sense, almost totally obscure to anyone who isn't a blockchain developer how these things work. But actually, the product is actually quite easy to understand, which is that we will find ways of being able to build models which don't require us to surrender our data in a kind of meaningful way. So on the personal level, pretty optimistic. At the geopolitical level, well, this is part of a phrase which you're going to hear more and more about. I'm sure it's in this room, as more than most others, strategic decoupling and the idea that the world is splitting apart in many important ways at the moment, and one of them is technological and data-wise, and that's just going to be, I think, part of the landscape moving forwards. Hopefully climate will be able to kind of carve out exceptions to that in certain ways, given the kind of globalness of the problem, but that is a trend that we're going to have to push more and more against, probably.
Thank you, Carl. Oh, wow.
For 1 second.
Okay, very
Just
quickly.
because I know that Carl wants us to disagree, so I'm going to disagree with him. I actually think that the world will go in a bifurcated way there too. That here, data sovereignty would be about individuals, here in the so-called democratic wall set of countries. And then other parts of the world, perhaps data sovereignty would be much more nationalist. And then we will see a sort of slightly different kind of clash going down the bifurcation route on the basis that, most of the individual data sovereignty point is here. And therefore, the farmer's problem here ultimately is a different problem to how do you deal with, let's say, Belt and Road investment in, the telecoms industry around the world, and therefore sweeping up data in a very different way. So I just think that even the data is going to go down that bifurcation, really.
So I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to go that side of the room for the first round of questions and then this side of the room for this second round of questions, because there are quite a lot. There's a lady here in front, and there's another lady there in the back, and then there's a gentleman here.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Doreen. I'm from Fresco Clean Tech Solutions, providing investment and financial advice to clean tech in niche sectors. So things like green hydrogen and offshore wind, floating offshore wind. The question to the panel is on regulation. We've seen the EU put out its AI Act a couple of weeks ago, which has very high-level principle thinking. The UK has yet to publish it, but the idea will be that it will be based on sectors. We don't have anything from the US as yet, and nothing from Asia. So given the fact that we are moving so quickly, what does the panel think about regulation? Secondly, a kind of a part B to that is, are humans smart enough to even regulate anymore? My simple example to this is that there are 2.85 billion users of Facebook, for example. So 2.85 billion people decided, I'm going to stick my mum's name on it, my address on it, tell the whole world about it. And one of our bank questions is, what's your mum's maiden name and where do you live? So where do we draw that line? Are we even going to get there?
Thank you. I think there was another lady there on the back. There. And then there's a gentleman here.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the insightful discussion. My name is Meena. I'm from Carbon Tracker. My question is, especially to Matt, is which parts of the power system can AI play a significant role to improve the way we use the system? For example, advanced renewables, forecasting, optimized storage, dispatch strategies, etc. Do you have an idea based on what you've found so far?
Thank you. And then here.
Thank you. Lindsay Stewart, Research Director at Morningstar, a data and research company. My question, very connected to what Doreen asked, revolves around the climate side versus the financing side. In financing, there's a lot of structure. We've had accounting standards for years. There are very established conventions on how to measure discounted cash flows and things. But on the climate side, we're still kind of laying in the ground rules, scope 3 thinking, scope 4, time value of avoided emissions, those kinds of things. So in such an unstructured and voluntary disclosure world, are we putting the cart before the horse by letting generative AI loose in that environment?
Questions?
Okay. On regulation. So I think we're going to see a few interesting things and different forces coming from different countries. You're going to see those who will push for AI regulation and those who will push not for AI regulation. You're going to see countries that want to experiment with new technology, which is unregulated. You could see markets, emerging markets. I don't know, Nigeria might be one of those that will say, and I'm going to let AI go because I need more developers in Africa, and this is what I need, and I need more investment to flow here, and this is what's going to open it, and that's what's going to give me advantage. You're going to see countries like India saying, this is for me, you know, I'm going to upskill my developers like this, I'm going to do things like that. You're going to see the US and China potentially battling heads over here. You're going to see the EU regulating. So I think we're going to see very, very different things here. Now, of course, climate is, on one hand, border blind, and on the other hand, very border biased in terms of where the investment is coming from and where is it flowing to. So I think that, so that was a complicated way of not giving you an answer, of course, right? But of saying that there's a need for a regulation that will make sure that that the basics are protected. The basics are protected, that there's little damage as possible done from misinformation, from fabrication, from hallucination, and mainly from bias. Bias, even if it is not intended, is one of the more damaging things. I'll give you an example. Imagine that we build this great model that says, as financial models go, right, we plug in a lot of numbers and metrics and say this is the interest rate on your loan, right, which has been done in financial sector for years. Now let's say that we're going to say, I'm going to plug in climate data and determines countries' credit rating based on that, based on some climate metrics, based on their physical risk, based on the policies they have in place, based on a bunch of other things. And we're still not doing that. There's emerging practice to start rating countries on that. Imagine that the data is biased. Why? Because it was only trained on global north data, because there's not enough data, because the way that people use language in order to interpret certain things. I don't know, in Japan, they still call it global warming in their law. So if we ask, does Japan talk about climate change? No, it doesn't, because we looked for the term climate change. Guess what? They talk about global warming. A very simplistic and inaccurate, of course, form of bias. And then we say, okay, we're plugging it into this black box, and out comes a number. And do we really want that number to guide our decisions? And this is where a lot of regulation needs to allow us to distinguish between the data and the decision making. And decision making is an ethical layer that sits on top of data. When you say this is going to do X, Y, Z, we have to ask, is X, Y, Z good? Good for what? Good for GDP, good for reducing inequality, good for reducing emissions, good for reducing emissions and air pollution will go up or air pollution will go down, right? That is I'm calling it an ethical decision because they are ethical decisions. We may all agree that reducing emissions is good, but do we reduce emissions at the price of kicking indigenous peoples off their lands to do it as quickly as possible, right? So we can start seeing there are a lot of complexities here. So the ability to distinguish data from decisions is a critical part of that regulation. The ability for us to know, you are now looking at data that was produced by machines. If you want to make a decision, you might want humans to check it. Or you're actually looking at something that was checked by a human already. Those are the bits of regulation that we want. The usual comparison, of course, is bringing it to how we regulate medicine or drugs, right? So you can band them all together, you can regulate them, you can have clinical trials, you can signpost, you can put ads, you can say you are allowed to advertise, not allowed to advertise. Those are the kind of regimes that we want.
If I can just comment there, but we already are deviating from it. So you're absolutely right. We do need to see when the data is coming from. But here in the UK, your proposed regulation is not even saying that. That's what the EU says. And we have no sense of
not having to speak for the UK government. That's so joyful, not having to speak for this government. Yeah.
Just to maybe pick up on the German zero. sorry to hog the conversation, but it's if you're collating data from the internet articles, we don't even know if those articles are generated by AI to begin with. So then that's why my question.
Felix, I don't know whether Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on some of the points which have already been said, particularly on Mikhail's and maybe some things that Bernice mentioned earlier on this being comfortable with lack of precision or inaccuracy, or to what extent, and who the and sort of where do those implications fall? Because I think this is a very crude simplification, and financial institutions take lots of different kinds of decisions. But if you're sat in a financial institution making lots of decisions, you can absorb some loss of accuracy. It's kind of inherent in the investment process that you're taking risk every time you make a decision. And even some bias within that may be okay. It could stack up systemic risks in the economy, but it might be just part of the sort of doing business. If you're the subject, if you're the company or the country, if it's sovereign debt, those have very big outsized effects on you. So if you just who suffers from the potential inaccuracies is very important, and that's why I mentioned in my introductory remarks how we're going to ensure that we can have a high degree of fidelity and accuracy over the most important points that we're analysing companies. It equally applies to countries, and how we can build the right infrastructure around that. Because it may be that in other kinds of applications we can afford to have more variation, but it matters a lot to you as might even be going back to the farmer as well. It applies in that context as well.
A person said at a person I won't attribute because it was in Chatham House Rule, an event I won't attribute at Chatham House Rule, but a person said, we may see the largest contraction in the workforce since the Black Death. Like, outside of climate, I don't want to be alarmist, but we might not have seen anything like this before, this technology. Like, I am on the hard regulate side of this. It's not even clear to me that we let this up to the market. I don't even know whether this isn't like nuclear technology, and this is something that we control a lot more closely than we do. It's mad to me that we're allowing Silicon Valley and concentrations of capital and particular ideologies have very, very weird views of the world, very different from almost everyone else, that are basically driving AI development at the moment to essentially mimic human beings. It doesn't have to be this way. Like, machine learning can do all kinds of things. You don't have to funnel most of our capital and most of our talent to basically build chatbots that are really, really good at mimicking other human beings. That's a decision that's been driven by markets, and a decision that's been driven, I think, in part by ideology. But no, there is a fair degree of alarm, I think it's fair to say, from the actual engineers working on some of these models. There was a very highly publicised letter, I'm sure you all saw it, very recently, where Geoffrey Hinton downwards, the people that actually make these techniques are alarmed about how fast they're developing, didn't anticipate them to be developing this fast, and would like everything to slow down for a bit. And I think that is the only way that we can possibly break this dynamic that we've all lived through pretty much all of our lives, people in this room, where technical progress outstrips our capacity for social and political reform to make sense of them. Whoops, it gets out there and everyone says, whoops, it's out the bag now, I guess we could better make the best of it. And that happens again and again, this kind of cascading disruptions. And that is causing all manner of political and social turmoil. So we need to slow it down 100%. I can't see how the benefits are going to outweigh the risks of just trying to pull these under kind of human and democratic, largely, control until we can work out how we're going to make sense of the, I think, almost inevitable seismic kind of societal implications that these technologies are going to have.
Thank you, Carl. Matt, did you raise your hand?
I'm not sure how I can go after the Black Death, but I'll answer Mina's point and the gentleman over there who talked about climate action. So I think with regards to climate action, it's more about confidence. So we're doing some work with the Indonesian government at the moment, supporting them in their transition off coal. And they currently and genuinely believe that they cannot power their economy without coal. They don't think a system predominantly supplied by wind and solar will work for them. They're an archipelago, thousands of islands, going to be very difficult. And I don't think a policy paper or an inspirational speech is going to change their mind. I think data and cash will. And that's where I think these sort of systems and this sort of approaches can work. And to Mina's point, I think there's two ways to think about this in terms of electricity systems. There's the operations component. So as Miguel mentioned, like electricity systems at the moment, or until very recently, were just coal and gas plants chugging along continuously. We're going from that to monitoring clouds to understand the amount of solar generation available on a 5-minute increment. That's a very different and more complex system. And ML and AI can help in that regard. And then there's capital decisions. So what needs to happen in the future, 2030, 2040. And back to the Indonesian example, based on the analysis that we've done, they will need 7 gigawatts of interconnectors. That's far greater than the total amount of operating interconnectors in the world at the moment. It's a huge, huge investment challenge. Someone needs to pay for that. And just on the farmers, just to throw another spanner in the works, I don't think it's as much about sharing as it is value. I think people are wising up that their data and their interactions with these models and the business models that support them is valuable. And my guess is farmers are just holding out for you to pay them more. There's the reason why I don't use Facebook, because I don't think it gives me any value, whereas ChatGPT I'm happy to use because it's, yeah.
We're 5 minutes on towards the end. I'm gonna have 2 questions here, and then what I'm going to try to do is ask the panelists to fold those questions, the answers, in their 1 minute sort of reflection. So questions first, and I'll give the lady
Great.
here and the gentleman. Okay, it doesn't matter.
Hi there. Gavin Starks from Icebreaker One. I want to bring a bit of hope in amongst the Black Death conversations. And then a question. One is, we're actually launching a programme tomorrow at Parliament to automate Scope 2 reporting by getting the data directly from smart meters from every SME in the country into the carbon reporting system. That's a bit of hope. It touches on a lot of things that, with the permission of the SME, by the way, just to the earlier point about data control. The question I've got here is, we've talked to AI about both data, and that data is both qualitative and quantitative. Now here, what we're obviously trying to address is the quantitative side. But one of the questions here in the whole acronym soup of carbon reporting and the complete abundance of confusion at the SME level in particular is what data really matters. And I think, to quote one large audit firm I was speaking to recently, ESG reporting is a random number generator right now. So when if we're to ask the question, what's the most important qualitative information and what's most important quantitative information, you have to pick one thing, what would it be?
Thank you. Sorry, just before you ask your question, just what I'm going to ask as you were wrapping your answers is to share in your final remark, what is one reflection or key takeaway you want to share with the people when, from this conversation? Sorry.
Claire Badanis, founder and director of Fulcrum Windsor. We advise companies on corporate reporting and write and produce annual reports largely for FTSE companies. My interest in this area is particularly on the accuracy point. And just for full disclosure, I did submit to the government consultation on regulation last week a proposal for regulating the use of AI, particularly large language model, in corporate reporting, precisely on the grounds of concerns about accuracy. Also, full disclosure, I'm probably on the Carl and Ian end of the spectrum on my views on this, and I have actually used the words like the nuclear bomb, we don't have to use it, on some of these things. So my question is here, there seems to be a bit of a difference in a debate around accuracy and what accuracy is and how important it is amongst the comments of the panel so far. One comment on that, I think there is certainly the older ones of us around here, and probably most of the panel here, we've grown up with a sense of objective reality, and I think that is changing with the use of machines and so on, and misinformation of how do you know what is true. But I think there also seems to be some agreement that accuracy is important because you have to base information, financial decisions, and investment on stuff that's real, not stuff that's not real. So in this context, how do we make these things more accurate? What's your proposal? What would your recommendation be for getting this stuff to be accurate?
Wow, that's a really big question. Thank you. It's a great question to end. Should we go like this? Felix, I'm sorry to put you on the spot to be the first person.
It's fine. I'm more like I'll keep going first, which feels unfair. Okay, I'm going to have a go at that one. So I think, and actually it was my takeaway as well, that I feel like we have some of the ingredients of the system that we need to build to to achieve the accuracy, even though we haven't built that system yet. That was kind of how I was thinking about it. But some of the specifics of how you go about that, partly it has to be triangulation, I think. And this sense of objective reality, like obviously, you know, data is data and there's always questions you can raise about it. But actually, you know, when Matt's analysing a power station and how many emissions, you know, that's connected something in the real world. And we've got to get closer to connecting that to the full company's value chain stack. And different analytics that look at that question should help us to ensure that the information which has been created, let's say, or generated by an LLM, is not completely disconnected from what we're seeing in the real world, or at least somehow, somewhere in that, I think, has to be the answer. But within that, we're going to need the kind of social or institutional structures in order to handle some of those questions as well. So I don't think it's a purely technical challenge. I'll stop there because there's lots
Thank
of
you.
points.
I actually realized we have more time for closing, so if you have more...
I'll come back.
No, you can come back to it. Sorry, Michael, please. So a little bit more
I started with bias, I'll complete with bias, and this is my personal bias. ESG and corporate reporting will remain moving deck chairs on the Titanic until we sort out the national level, until we sort out the real regulation. Because how much electricity do you consume if your electricity is produced by coal and gas, and if you're driving cars that burn oil, that doesn't matter. All of that reporting won't make a difference. It will really just be arranging and moving and carbon accounting and carbon credits, and all of that is nice. And as a system, having to have the data in order to push for systemic changes, that's where it starts getting interesting, and that's where we start seeing interesting decisions in the climate investment world happening. Because if you're in a pension fund that needs to pay out in 40 years' time, you kind of want the world to exist and to be like a decent place in 40 years' time. So the institutional investors have an incentive to push for systemic stability. And that's where a lot of the investment decisions matter. And that's where starting to get some of the first movers and starting to get the pricing right in a way that doesn't like, when the price is right, everyone will go there, right? It's so easy to buy things that are cheap. It's much more expensive. It's much more difficult to buy things that are expensive, and a lot of that is regulation. Subsidies are, determine how much our food costs. Subsidies determine how much our energy costs. Those things can be changed, and that is where the quantitative and the qualitative data is the most relevant. How can those change the national level? And the second thing, and that is on kind of an LLM bias, opening up the data and opening up the models is critical to this, is critical for transparency, and it's critical for bias correction. The explosion and the speed at which the open data and the open models are progressing is a real source for optimism here. When OpenAI landed its GPT-3 and GPT-4 and all of those, the predictions were that the models the open models will catch up years later, 2 years later. They caught up months later with a fraction of the computational cost that was anticipated. Investing in that, supporting that, creating regulation that supports that, enabling that, talking about it, those are the things that can help us get over the line and can help us correct our biases and expose and correct the accuracy that we're all desperate for.
So in terms of key takeaways, I think the big thing in all of this is trust, because you've got to trust that the people using it are doing it purposely and they're doing it for the right reasons. That means you've also got to trust the developers, you've got to trust the data, you've got to trust the regulations that sit around all of this. And I think that lack of trust is something that is going to be a barrier to adoption. So the speed at which it's adopted, I think, will be slower and that's possibly a good thing. When it comes to financial services, there was a question about should AI be allowed and all the rest of it. The challenge we've got is in a heavily regulated environment, it's not really going to feature until we're really quite certain about it. It would take a huge amount of lobbying, not to say it wouldn't happen, but a huge amount of lobbying to have a black box system doing credit rationing decisions. It just doesn't happen because of the fear of bias. And so when you look at very UK-centric, but the Bank of England, the PRA and so on, that's just not allowed. So actually I think financial services, once you see it being adopted as a really mainstream thing where you will put money based upon something that comes out of one of these systems, I think that will give you an indication that the system's probably at the right point. You're not going to see a pension fund trustee make a decision today saying, well, we put 100 million there because ChatGPT, whatever, said so. It's just not going to happen because you can't explain it and you can't stand by it as a decision. But I think we'll get to that point. So for me, that's a big signal as to when the technology is caught up to the place we want it to be. The other thing for me is humans make mistakes, but we're slightly more forgiving of them. So the systems, we need to be very aware of the biases and the errors and the challenges that they create, but humans are not without their own imperfections on all of this. And my final one is the speed of development's amazing because there's now a Glaswegian ChatGPT. So you can interrogate that one and it answers questions in a way which possibly only me understands just now, but it's very good fun.
Well, I'm sorry, everyone. I feel like the Black Death comment might have alarmed some people in the room. And like, you know, and look, I am sorry. I'm sorry to ladle so much doom on like otherwise like a really exciting interaction between emerging tech and climate financing decisions. You know, but here's a final note of optimism. You know, there's many more of us that obviously want to protect information spaces than those that wish to suborn them. We're smarter than they are. We're more innovative than they are. We're better connected, I think, than they are. Very often, I think, you know, ultimately we're also better funded. So there's nothing to think that we won't be able to protect information spaces, at least the ones that we care about. But I'd say to everyone here, you know, the most important takeaway from me, the most important final thought is just don't ignore the fact that this kind of weird conflict is happening and that in one way or another, it might kind of in a strange way like ripple into your world, and don't be surprised when it does. Like know that in some cases these information spaces are contested and that information warfare exists. And if you do see it, you know, reach out to the folks at Coalition Against Climate Disinformation. There's organising happening. There's NGOs being set up. There's NGOs that are increasingly pivoting onto this. Like we will win this kind of fight to defend information, but we will only win it by not ignoring that it's happening. And sooner or later, we'll move away from the vocabulary of warfare around information, but only when we begin to actually work out what peacekeeping looks like.
It's much more optimistic. Well done, Carl. No, I'll just make a couple of remarks. I think that the point about accuracy, just maybe from a practitioner's perspective, is always involving humans. For us, when we do work, particularly in emerging markets, we make sure we work with local partners, and they are the ones validating what we do. So for us, it's all, I think, this question of accuracy is more common sense for our use cases. But I understand your philosophy behind the question. With regards to Miguel's point about like optimism, I think that is so true about open source. And I think it was actually 5 days rather than a couple of months for the open source community to catch up with ChatGPT. There was a really good memo that was leaked by a Google data scientist, and it was titled, We have no moat, and neither does OpenAI. And that tracked through how the Google model was flawed and how open source was always going to cut their lunch. And I think on top of that, just how this closed source business model is potentially not going to work in this instance. And that brings me back to this regulation point, which is maybe controversial. So shortly after ChatGPT 4 was launched, the CEO of OpenAI presented to Congress about how this whole space needed to be regulated heavily. He wasn't doing that because he's a nice guy and feels good about the world or wants the world to be a good place. What he was really trying to do is create a monopoly for OpenAI, and I think that's what I fear about regulation, is that we'll just have Google and OpenAI owning the space, and that can't be a good thing. And indeed, that's the reason why a couple of 20-year-olds raised 100 million a couple of weeks ago. It's because they know that the Europeans need to create their own ChatGPT, and that's why they raised the money. So I'll just stop there.
Well, I mean, it's always good to end where you start, which is I started off with accuracy, transparency, and intentionality. My fear is that the ChatGPT world is moving us away from aspiration for absolute high standards to one that is good enough. And I kind of feel that now the battle is to be able to tell the difference between good enough versus good, despite the fact that humans are flawed. And in fact, we indeed, I would quite happily admit that I probably said a lot of inaccurate things throughout this panel today, for example. However, this is where sort of words are helpful, the truthiness concept. The Chatham House rule, exactly. But with that, I think from my perspective, my takeaway is that I would like to believe that if everyone here is working towards accuracy, transparency, fidelity, and obviously intentionality, we will have, in general, the world a much stronger baseline. So no one will start from scratch, even though the from scratch could be helpful in ascertaining, all the things that we care about, fidelity, accuracy, etc. But nonetheless, if we could build that baseline, which is higher than current one, thereby everyone is from this generation onwards, everyone else going to university next will be building on top of that. If we found a way to crack that, then I actually am far more optimistic about the world than I would have been otherwise, despite the fact that we may kill each other before we manage to get there. But thanks.
Thank you. So before I do the actual closing, I have a couple of announcements. So we have a couple of events at Chatham House today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. There is a climate and youth movement an event later today. There is a simulation that if you sign up to, it's a system level game. So for people who wants to do game playing and learn about system thinking, there is a game upstairs at some point somewhere. Need to ask our staff. And then afterwards there is tea and coffee. But before I release you to tea and coffee, I didn't think that I was going to end the discussion thinking about having a more philosophical approach. And it is, which is like we are collectively embarking in this necessity for transition so that we have a future, right? And I think the mindset is, for those who work in climate change space, is that yes, we can, because otherwise why we're here, right? But then in the journey of yes, we can, we're grappling with this interaction of what does it mean to be a human being? And then how do we sort of, embrace whatever technology and robots and machines coming our way. One final thing I want to say, as we were discussing here, there is I should be plugging for Netflix, but anyway, there is a really cool series on Netflix called Death, Robot, and Love. And there is a really good, you know what I'm talking about, right? There is a really good episode that I would recommend you watch that has a really, really good end punchline about the cats and the robots. So with that, thank you very much, and a round of applause to